The ceasefire notification came through at 3:47, and by 3:49 Matteo Vard knew it wasn't going to hold. He was at his desk in the humanitarian post, a converted relay station at the edge of the Velthari corridor that smelled permanently of recycled air and cold tea, scrolling the ceasefire monitoring feeds when the first anomaly registered. A drone contact in grid 7, 11 kilometers south. Then a second, in grid 4. Then a third in grid 4, louder, the kind of signal that the monitoring system flagged in red rather than yellow. Then the feeds went to buffering, which they did whenever the compact's ceasefire infrastructure was being actively overwhelmed, and Matteo pushed back from his desk, stretched his neck, and started filling out a priority alert form because that was what the protocol said to do. He'd filed 47 priority alert forms in 8 months in the corridor. He'd received routing confirmation on 11 of them. The other 36 had gone into the compact's administrative system and surfaced, when they surfaced at all, in the form of automated status updates that said the alert had been received and was pending review, usually about 3 weeks after whatever the alert had been about had already resolved itself one way or another. He filed the forms anyway, because the timestamp record mattered, and because somewhere in the compact's systems, there was a data trail building up that might eventually prompt someone with actual authority to notice that the corridor's ceasefire monitoring infrastructure consistently failed during active exchange periods, and that this was a problem. He was on his third priority alert form. The first 2 had failed to route entirely, which was also typical. When Develle Marsh came through the door with a look on her face that he had learned, in 8 months of the corridor, meant something had gone from bad to worse. Develle was the post-civilian liaison, which meant she spent most of her days talking to terrified families on the far side of bureaucratic walls. She had a gift for holding her voice steady and her face professional in the middle of things that were not professional at all, and she deployed that gift continuously because the work required it. When the professional face slipped, even slightly, it was information. "The Velthari evacuation convoy in the southern grid," she said. "The one we cleared last night." "Cleared and scheduled," Matteo said. He'd done the paperwork himself. Route 7, 300 departure, 3 vehicles, 17 registered individuals. He'd triple-checked the clearance against the ceasefire monitoring schedule before he filed it. At 2:55, when he'd verified the route for the last time before the convoy's departure window, Grid 7 South had been quiet. What happened? It was not a question. He could already see it in her face. "They hit an ordnance strike at 3:20, the lead vehicle and the third vehicle." She stopped, drew a breath. "The middle vehicle was caught in the secondary debris wave. It's largely intact. The middle vehicle contained a single family, the Roth household, parents and a 6-year-old. The parents were another stop. The parents were not in the middle vehicle when it was found. Current assessment is that they were outside the vehicle when the strike occurred." Matteo was already standing. "The 6-year-old was not with them," Develle continued. "She wasn't recovered at the vehicle site. Her beacon is transmitting. The compact's forward position has the southern sector locked, active fire exchange in grid 4, ceasefire violations across the board. No civilian crossing, no aid crossing, no exceptions. Commander Velith is very clear." "Where's the child's beacon signal?" Develle looked at her screen. "Intermittent. Compact evacuation standard, 6.4 band. It's coming from the agricultural settlement at Grid 7 South. The middle vehicle's last telemetry puts it approximately 800 meters west of the settlement, so she either moved or was moved before the beacon registered there." "The settlement is inside the locked sector." "Yes." "How long has she been there?" "The strike was 3:20. It is now 4:06. 46 minutes. A 6-year-old alien child, Velthari species, sitting somewhere in a gutted agricultural settlement in the middle of a sector that had been declared off-limits because of an active exchange that was not, as far as Matteo could tell from the grid data, actually anywhere near Grid 7 South. The exchange was in Grid 4, running hot along the ridge line. Grid 7 South was 4 kilometers west of Grid 4. It was inside the locked designation, but the lock was a blanket designation, not a precision designation. It covered the entire southern sector regardless of where the exchange actually was, because blanket designations were easier to administer than precise ones, and the Compact's corridor command prioritized administrative ease. Matteo picked up his field jacket. "Velith has physically closed the checkpoint gate," Devell said. "He told me, specifically me, by name, that no one from this post crosses it. He also told me that if he sees a civilian from this post attempting to cross, he will detain them for their own safety under emergency civilian protection protocols." She paused. "I am telling you this so you have complete information." "What's the terrain between the checkpoint and the settlement?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled up the terrain map on her secondary screen and turned it toward him, which was also complete information. The checkpoint gate was 2.4 kilometers from the agricultural settlement. The route was open, former agricultural land, fallow fields, low grass, 2 shallow drainage channels running north-south, elevation change of about 6 meters over the full distance. Low cover, flat approach. The settlement itself was a cluster of low stone and composite buildings at the edge of the former growing zone. The east side collapsed from an earlier strike sometime in the previous year, the west side still largely standing. Matteo studied the map for about 30 seconds. "I need my field kit," he said, "and the portable beacon relay from the equipment shelf, the one that locks onto 6.4 band signals." Devell was quiet for a moment. The professional stillness that she wore as a working tool was very evident, and underneath it, visible to anyone who had worked alongside her for 8 months, was the face of someone making a decision about what kind of witness to be. She crossed to the equipment shelf and handed him the portable beacon relay without saying anything. "Range?" he asked. 6 kilometers effective lock. Starts acquiring at 8. She watched him clip it to his field kit. "If you get within range, it will lock onto her beacon and relay her position back here in real time. If you lose comms, if your own signal drops, I will send the filing record and your last telemetry to the Compact Emergency Coordinator and to the Velthari diplomatic mission simultaneously. So there is a record, and so the people who should know what's happening know." He looked at her. "Keep filing the priority alerts," he said. "I know. And if Velith stops me at the gate, keep filing them anyway. Don't stop." "I won't, a beat, don't get shot." He went. The checkpoint gate at the southern boundary of the humanitarian post was a heavy alloy frame on counterweight hinges, compact military issue, with the Compact insignia stenciled on the crossbar in the slightly faded blue-gray paint that meant it had been there for at least 2 years. It had been open most of Matteo's time here, a qualified open, the kind with a 48-hour advance filing requirement and a route approval process that took longer than it should and cleared less often than it needed to, but open. Passable. The mechanism of a functioning relationship between the post and the Compact forward position, frayed and slow but functional. Commander Velith was standing at it when Matteo arrived. He'd expected that. Devell had told him Velith had physically closed the gate, which meant Velith had anticipated that someone from the post would show up at it, which meant Velith was either going to be here himself or had stationed someone here. And a man like Velith stationed himself rather than delegating an argument he'd already decided to have. He was a Compact man in his late 40s. Matteo had looked up his service record when he first arrived at the post, as he looked up everyone he'd be working with in the corridor, with the efficient stillness of someone who had been in uniform long enough that military posture had become the only posture. Full field armor, because the exchange in Grid 4 had apparently been sufficient cause for full armor, even at a checkpoint 4 kilometers away. Two of his personnel flanking him, also in field armor, also very still. The gate behind him latched. "Mr. Vard," Velith said. "Commander, you've been briefed on the sector lock." "I have. I'm going to tell you again clearly so there is no ambiguity about what you understood when you made whatever decision you've come here to make." He didn't raise his voice. There was no need to raise it. The pre-dawn quiet of the corridor made even a measured tone carry. "The southern sector is locked. The exchange is live. Civilian crossing is prohibited under compact emergency protocol, corridor designation, active conflict clause. This applies to humanitarian personnel. This applies to aid-credentialed workers. This applies to individuals operating under post-authorization. There are no exceptions to the lock until I assess the sector at 800 and authorize a crossing based on that assessment." "The child's beacon is intermittent," Matteo said. "If it drops before 800, we lose her position in an 8-square-kilometer sector." "I'm aware." "A Velthari child, 6 years old, 47 minutes in grid 7 south since a vehicle strike that." "Mr. Vard," Velith's voice did not change. "I am aware of all of this. I received the same information you did at approximately the same time. What I also know, which you may not have the operational data to know, is that the exchange in Grid 4 is unpredictable on a minute-to-minute basis, that the monitoring drones I had in the southern sector were redeployed to 4 and 6 during the initial exchange surge, and that I cannot tell you with any certainty what the actual threat environment in 7 South is right now. That uncertainty is precisely what the lock exists to manage. The last drone contact in 7 South was, Matteo checked his field unit, 61 minutes ago. The current contact in Grid 4 is at the Ridge Line, eastern approach, which puts it approximately 4 kilometers from the route between this checkpoint and the settlement. A brief silence. Velith's expression did not shift. "You've done the terrain analysis," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I've been routing supply drops across this corridor for 8 months. I know every grid designation between here and the southern boundary." "Knowing the grid designations is not the same as knowing whether you'll take fire walking across them." "No," Matteo said, "but it's better than not knowing them." Another silence. One of Velith's flanking personnel shifted very slightly, the small adjustment of a person who was listening to a conversation they hadn't expected to be as complicated as it was turning out to be. "Let me be precise about something," Velith said. "I cannot authorize you to cross this gate. That authorization does not exist under current sector conditions. If you cross this gate without authorization, you cross as a civilian in a locked sector without compact protection, without military escort, and without any legal standing under the emergency protocol. If you are killed or injured in the sector, the compact's recovery obligation does not apply until the sector clears. I cannot send personnel after you, and I will not. That is not a threat, that is the protocol, and if you're going to do whatever you're about to do, you deserve to understand exactly what it means." "I understand," Matteo said. "I want you to have it on record that you told me clearly and completely, and that I understood, and that I'm choosing to proceed anyway. I'm not doing this because I think you're wrong about the protocol. I'm doing it because there is a 6-year-old child who has been alone in a war zone for 48 minutes, and the protocol cannot get there before 800. Velith looked at him for a long moment. He was not, Matteo thought, an unreasonable man. He was a man who worked inside a system that required him to be certain things in certain situations, and who was being asked, in this particular situation, to watch someone walk into a locked sector in the pre-dawn dark. The expression on his face was the expression of someone doing the math on multiple variables simultaneously, and finding that the math did not resolve cleanly. "Your crossing without authorization will be in my report," Velith said. "I know. Formally and completely. I expect nothing less." Velith stepped back from the gate. Not to open it, he stepped back, creating a gap between himself and the crossbar, and turned his attention to a fixed point about 15 degrees to Mateo's left, which happened to be the section of the perimeter wall that had nothing interesting on it. His two flanking personnel did the same, a practiced movement, too smooth to be coincidental. Mateo lifted the latch and walked through. The walkout was 2.4 kilometers, and Mateo covered it in 24 minutes. He'd timed a supply route across similar terrain before the sector closed, 18 minutes at a normal pace. He was moving slower than normal, because he was moving low and stopping every 3 or 4 minutes to listen, and to check the beacon relay's acquisition status, and because the drainage channels required a full stop and a sightline check before he crossed them. The exchange noise from Grid 4 was a background constant, not close, not the kind of noise that indicated something was moving in his direction, just the established sound of the situation, the way the corridor always sounded when the ceasefire wasn't holding. He covered the first 800 meters in 10 minutes. The terrain was exactly as he'd expected, fallow grass, flat, the low cover of the irrigation berms between the old field lines. Nothing moving that he could detect. The beacon relay came up to 24% acquisition, which meant he was still too far out for a lock. The first drainage channel was a shallow cut in the ground, maybe 40 centimeters deep, running north-south across the route. He went down into it, stopped, listened for 30 seconds, then crossed quickly and went back to low ground on the other side. Nothing moved. The exchange noise in Grid 4 was slightly louder from this position, or maybe it was his perception, because he was now outside the gate, and the absence of anything between him and the Grid 4 ridge was more present to him than it had been before. He kept moving. At the 1.2 kilometer mark, he stopped behind one of the old irrigation berm lines and checked the relay again. 47% acquisition. The signal was still intermittent. He could see it on the relay's display, the child's beacon pulsing in and out of range in a pattern that suggested the beacon unit was physically damaged, not that she was moving. If she was moving, the signal pattern would be different. This was the pattern of a damaged unit on a stationary source, and a stationary source in a vehicle strike situation meant she had found somewhere to stay still and was staying there. He knew why Velthari children went still. He'd read it in the intake briefing that the post gave all new coordinators, the section on species behavioral profiles for the populations they were most likely to work with in the corridor. It was an evolutionary response, deep in the genome, older than the species' spaceflight capability, from a period in Velthari prehistory when the primary survival strategy for children in a dangerous environment was to be invisible. Go still. Go quiet. Wait for an adult to come. He was coming. He just needed her to keep the beacon transmitting. He crossed the second drainage channel at the 18-minute mark. The relay jumped to 63% as he came up the other side, and he adjusted his heading slightly southwest based on the signal direction. The settlement was in front of him and slightly right, and the signal was coming from the left side of it, the west-facing side, which was the side Devel's terrain map had shown as the structurally intact section. He stopped at the top of the drainage channel bank and held position for 45 seconds. Listened. The exchange noise in Grid 4 was present and steady, not escalating, not contracting, just there, the sound of a situation sustaining itself. The sky to the east was beginning to lighten in the way that happened an hour before actual dawn, a darkening of the dark into something that wasn't yet distinguishable from night, but that had a different quality at the edges. He could make out the settlement silhouette ahead, the low line of the building roof lines, the collapsed section on the east side visible as an irregular interruption in the profile, the intact west section standing. He moved toward it. He reached the settlement perimeter at the 22-minute mark. The agricultural settlement was what the corridor always produced after 2 years of contested territory. the bones of a functional place, stripped of everything useful and sitting in the kind of still that was not peaceful but exhausted. The stone and composite buildings had been meant for seed storage and equipment housing, and the kind of light industrial agricultural processing that a small Velthari farming community used. The east side had taken the earlier strike badly. 2 buildings collapsed inward, a third leaning at an angle that suggested it was intact only by structural stubbornness. The west side was standing, not intact, not unaffected, but upright. The agricultural settlement was what the corridor always produced after 2 years of contested territory. The bones of a functional place, emptied out. The buildings were stone and composite construction, the Velthari agricultural style that Matteo had seen versions of across the zone, low profiles, thick walls, the practical architecture of a community that had been building to last before the question of what things lasted through changed. The east side had taken the earlier strike badly. 2 buildings collapsed inward, a third leaning at the specific angle of a structure that had lost one load-bearing element and was being held up by the others having an argument about it. The west side was standing. He moved along the west face of the outermost building, keeping close to the wall. The stone was cold under his hand. Inside the building, something had settled. He heard a faint creak, the adjustment of an old structure to temperature change as the pre-dawn cold deepened. Nothing more. Nothing moving. He checked the relay, 79% and climbing. The convoy vehicle was against the western wall of the largest intact building. Matteo found it by the telemetry marker on his field unit before he saw it visually. It had come to rest with its side panel against the stone wall, at an angle that suggested it had been traveling when the debris wave caught it and had slid into the wall rather than hitting it head-on. The front section was destroyed. The ordnance strike had taken it fully, the way those strikes did, fast and total. The middle section and rear were intact, the vehicle's body structure having absorbed what the front section's destruction had redirected away from the passenger and cargo areas. The relay hit 89% and locked. The source was inside the vehicle, a stationary source, the beacon still pulsing in its damaged, irregular pattern, but there, present. Not a beacon transmitting from a body. The medical indicator would have changed if the child was dead. This was a living signal. Matteo crossed the open ground between the settlement perimeter and the vehicle in the low-running crouch that his body had decided on somewhere in the first drainage channel without any particular conscious decision, and stopped at the vehicle's passenger door. It was open, not by damage, but ajar, the handle in the open position, which meant someone had opened it from the inside after the vehicle stopped. He listened. Nothing. Then, under the background exchange noise and the slight wind across the fallow fields and the ambient sounds of the corridor at pre-dawn, breathing, slow and very quiet, but there, coming from the rear of the vehicle. "My name is Matteo," he said. He kept his voice low and even not loud enough to carry far, not so quiet that it would seem secretive to someone listening. "I'm a humanitarian worker from the post at the northern checkpoint. I'm here to take you somewhere safe." He touched his chest, the flat-palmed self-identification gesture from the species protocol section of the intake briefing. "Safe. I'm going to take you out of here now." A pause, the breathing continued. He moved to the rear of the vehicle and found the cargo hatch. It was a low panel in the rear section, standard configuration for Velthari civilian transport and cargo accessed from a hatch rather than integrated with the passenger compartment, which meant the cargo space was partially separated from the passenger space by the vehicle's internal structure. The hatch was open about 3 centimeters. He could see the edge of it in his field unit's light. He pulled it fully open, slowly. In the space inside, low, dark, the cargo space of a vehicle designed for household transport, which meant it was packed with the objects a family moving under an evacuation order considered worth carrying. A pair of amber eyes looked back at him. She was in the far corner, fitted into the angle where the cargo space's rear wall met the side wall, knees drawn up and arms wrapped around them in the posture of a small creature that had decided this corner was the safest reachable point and had not left it. Opalescent pale blue skin, the particular luminescent quality of Velthari biology that caught even the low light of the field unit and gave it back in a slightly different register. Silver-white hair fine as spun thread, matted with dust and debris. A line of dried blood from a small cut at her hairline, the kind that scalp cuts produced in quantity and then stopped when they were ready. A debris graze on her right forearm, not deep. The silver-white plating that ran along the Velthari jawline and brow, protective, biological. The species' remnant armor was intact, no damage. She was shaking. A fine, continuous tremor, the kind that came from adrenaline sustained over a long period, from a small body that had been holding itself very still in a very frightening place for 49 minutes. She was looking at him without blinking. He crouched down in front of the cargo hatch so that he was at her eye level. He kept his hands visible and open. He kept his voice at the same even register he'd been using, the one that said calm and present without trying to be reassuring in a way that would feel false. "My name is Matteo," he said again. "The people at the post know where you are. Your beacon told us. I'm here to walk you back." He touched his chest again. "Safe, we're going to go now." The amber eyes watched him. The tremor continued. He did not reach in, did not try to take her hand or draw her toward him or indicate with any gesture that she needed to move faster than she was ready to move. He had read enough of the species protocol to know that Velthari children in distress processed new information in their own time, and that rushing the processing made it worse. He held position and he waited, and he let her look at him for as long as she needed. It was approximately 50 seconds. He counted, because counting gave his mind something to do while the rest of him stayed still. She uncurled from the corner. Not fast, not a sudden decision, but a gradual unfurling, the testing motion of a small body establishing whether the new situation was what it appeared to be. She moved to the edge of the cargo hatch and stopped there, sitting at the lip of it, feet dangling. She was very small. He registered that again sharply, the specific smallness of 6 years old, which was its own thing, not proportionally smaller than an adult but categorically different. She put one hand on his forearm. He stayed still. She looked at her own hand on his arm for a moment. Then she looked at his face. Then she put both arms around his neck and pressed her face against his shoulder. He lifted her out of the cargo compartment, carefully, adjusting his hold so that she was secure against his chest and his right arm was free. She was very light. He registered this as a secondary fact while his primary attention moved immediately back to the route, 2.4 kilometers, the 2 drainage channels, the sightline from the Grid 4 ridge, the relay now showing 91% and locked on her beacon which was physically attached to her and therefore traveling with them. The beacon's irregular pulse would now show at the post as a moving signal, and Devel would know they were moving, and Devel would tell Velith, and the situation would be what the situation was. He stepped back out into the pre-dawn. The walk back was 31 minutes. It was slower than the approach, the additional weight and the additional care, and the operational reality of carrying a child across open ground in a locked sector, with an intermittent exchange running 4 kilometers east. He went lower on the ground than he had on the approach, and he stopped more, and at the second drainage channel he went aground entirely because the exchange noise from Grid 4 spiked sharply at the 23-minute mark, a surge that lasted 4 minutes and 13 seconds before it dropped back to its established level. During those 4 minutes, he lay in the drainage channel with sail held close against his chest. She was perfectly still, perfectly quiet. The evolutionary reflex, she could feel that stillness was the right response, and she followed it without any signal from him, without any instruction. Her face was turned toward his chest, and her arms were still around him in the grip she'd maintained since the cargo hatch. A grip that was lighter than he'd expected but entirely steady. The grip of someone who had decided this was where they were going to be and was not going to change that. The exchange noise dropped. He waited another 45 seconds, then got up and kept moving. He reached the checkpoint gate at the 36-minute mark from the vehicle, 57 minutes total from when he'd walked through the gate in the other direction. Velith was at the gate. Both of his personnel were at the gate. Develle was at the edge of the post side of the gate, standing with her hands at her sides and her screen under her arm, and the expression on her face when he came out of the pre-dawn dark with a small Velthari child in his arms was something he'd never quite seen on her before, not relief exactly, but the expression of a person whose worst scenario hadn't happened and who was still in the process of understanding that. He walked through the gate. Velith's personnel moved forward automatically and took his field unit and the beacon relay without being asked, a practiced motion, efficient. Velith himself stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked at the child. She had turned her face to look at the new environment when they came through the gate. She was taking it in with those steady amber eyes, the gate, the post building, the lights, Velith and his people, Develle, the whole sudden presence of other people after 57 minutes of being alone, and then 49 minutes before that. Her grip on Matteo's jacket had not loosened. "What's her name?" Velith asked. His voice was different from how it had been at the gate on Matteo's way out, still measured, still precise, but something in the texture of it had shifted in a way that was not in the direction of less feeling. "Sale," Develle said. She had the intake file on her screen. She'd clearly had it open for some time. Sale Roth, age 6 years and 3 months by the intake registration. She's registered to the post's evacuation program. The Roth family was on Route 7. Is their family? Her parents were in the lead vehicle. Develle's voice was level in the way that it was level when she was working very hard to keep it that way. The Velthari diplomatic mission maintains a contact protocol for unaccompanied minors in the corridor. I've already initiated it. Velith looked at Sale for another moment. Then he looked at Matteo. Your unauthorized crossing will be in my report, he said. I know. Fully documented. It should be. A pause. Something moved through Velith's expression that was not precisely a smile, but occupied the same category of thing. I will also note, he said, accurately and formally, that a 6-year-old Velthari child registered to this post's evacuation program was recovered alive from a locked sector by a civilian humanitarian worker, and that the sector's compact forward position was unable to authorize a recovery operation during the relevant window due to active exchange conditions. He said it with the flat precision of a man making an accurate factual record. Both things will be in the report. He stepped back. His personnel stepped back. Matteo carried Sale into the post. The medical unit was one room with 6 beds, a supply cabinet that was chronically understocked, and a portable diagnostic unit that Matteo had repaired 3 times since his arrival, because the requisition for a replacement had not resolved and probably wasn't going to. The post's medical coordinator, a woman named Orvith who had been in the corridor for 2 years and had learned Velthari diagnostic protocols from the published mission medical database, rather than from formal training because formal training wasn't available, was waiting at the door when Matteo arrived. She'd clearly been standing there for a while. He handed Sale over carefully, maintaining the contact until Orvith had her secure, not releasing too fast, and then stepped back. Sale submitted to the medical assessment with the same careful, watchful patience she'd shown since he'd found her. She allowed Orvith to clean and dress the forearm graze. She allowed the diagnostic unit scanner to pass over her. She watched Orvith throughout with those steady eyes, assessing, deciding what this new adult was and what her presence meant. When Orvith produced the nutrient formula in the Velthari dietary profile, the post maintained emergency supplies for the most common species in the corridor's evacuation population, and Velthari families were on the most common list. Sale accepted the container, looked at it, and drank. Matteo sat in the chair at the edge of the room. The exhaustion arrived about 30 seconds after he sat down, which was approximately how it always went, not during the thing itself, never during, but in the window immediately after when the body caught up to the invoice it had been deferring. His hands were shaking slightly. He noticed this as a matter of fact without any particular reaction and did not try to stop them. He looked at them for a moment, at the fine involuntary tremor that was the body reporting back, and acknowledged it and waited for it to pass. He'd had enough situations in 8 months of the corridor to know it passed. The field jacket had debris dust along the left sleeve, a long smear of it from the drainage channel, and a tear in the fabric at the shoulder that he hadn't noticed. His boots had picked up the limestone silt from the drainage channels, and it was drying now, lightening. The whole of him, he thought, looked like someone who had walked 4.8 kilometers in the pre-dawn dark of a contested sector, which was accurate. Orvith, without being asked, crossed to where he was sitting and handed him a field dressing and indicated his left shin with a slight tilt of her chin. He looked down. A debris graze, a clean one, not deep, the kind that produced a thin line of dark on the skin. He hadn't felt it, wouldn't have known it was there. He dressed it while she went back to Sale, and the efficiency of the exchange, her having noticed it, him having accepted the dressing without requiring an explanation, felt like the particular competence of people who worked in the same kind of conditions long enough to develop a shared operational shorthand. Develle came in at some point. He wasn't tracking time precisely. She set a cup of tea on the table beside his chair. The post's tea was always cold. The heating element had been broken for 3 months, and they'd been waiting on a requisition that was never going to come, and sat in the chair across from him. The diplomatic mission responded to the initial contact, she said. She had her screen on her lap. The duty officer picked up on first contact. They have a family connection for Sale, her maternal aunt, a woman named Neva Roth, who's currently at the mission compound 2 sectors north. They're authorizing a mission transport. Estimated arrival time is approximately, she checked her screen, 7:30. Matteo looked at Sale. The child had worked her way through the formula container and was now sitting on the diagnostic bed with the empty container still in her hands, looking at the room with the methodical attention of someone cataloging new information. When her gaze reached Matteo, it stopped. She looked at him for a moment. He nodded at her. She did not nod back. Velthari children didn't use that gesture. He knew from the protocol briefings. But she held his gaze steadily in a way that felt like a response. "She's not going to remember most of this," Orvith said quietly from across the room. She had her back to them, organizing the supply cabinet, making an assumption of privacy in a small room. Children this age, the stress indicators will clear with adequate support. What she will have is the shape of it, not the detail. "What does that mean?" Matteo asked. "It means she'll know she was alone somewhere frightening and then she wasn't. She'll know an adult came. She won't have the words for what happened for a long time, and when she does have the words, some of the specifics will be gone." A pause. "That's usually how it works anyway. Every child is different." Matteo drank his cold tea and looked at the tile floor and thought about the shape of things, what it would feel like, years from now, to have the shape of something without the detail, whether the shape of someone coming would be enough. He thought it probably was. He thought the shape was probably the important part. The mission transport arrived at 8:14. It was a Velthari diplomatic vehicle. Low and fast, the silver-inlaid hull markings of mission status, the kind that cleared compact checkpoints without inspection, because the clearance arrangements predated the current conflict period by decades. It came through the northern gate, which had been open all morning, and stopped in the post's receiving bay. The woman who stepped out was tall, Velthari adult height, which was somewhat above human average, particularly noticeable because she moved with the upright carriage of someone accustomed to walking through rooms where they were the person in charge. Opalescent blue skin, deeper and more saturated than Sale's in the way adult pigmentation was richer than a child's. The same amber eyes. Silver-white hair in a complex arrangement that was clearly not designed for a 814 emergency transport. It was the arrangement of someone who had been in a professional context when the call came and had not stopped to change it. Her name was Neva Roth, Sale's mother's sister. She came through the post door with the contained urgency of someone who had spent the last 2 hours receiving bad news and good news in the same communication, and was still sorting out which was which. She stopped when she saw Sale. Sale was still on the diagnostic bed. She'd given up on the empty formula container at some point. Orvith had quietly removed it and was sitting with the thermal blanket around her shoulders, feet dangling, watching the door. When Neva Roth came through it, she said something in Velthari, short, 3 syllables, the tonal quality of a name, and Neva Roth crossed the room in 4 steps and gathered her up. She held her for a long time. Matteo looked at the wall. Develle looked at her screen. Orvith found something to organize in the supply cabinet. It was the only privacy available in a single-room medical unit, and they all offered it simultaneously and without discussion. When Neva Roth finally turned around, she had Sale on her hip, the child's head resting on her shoulder, eyes still open, watching the room, and her expression was the specific composition of someone who has had the worst morning of their life and received in the middle of it one thing that held. She looked at Matteo. "You are the one who went in," she said. "Yes. They told me the sector was closed." "It was." She studied him for a moment. The amber eyes were assessing, the same fundamental quality as Sale's gaze, the same watching, but with more behind it, the additional weight of an adult who had been doing consequential work long enough to have calibrated what it looked like. Sale stirred on her hip. She turned her head and looked at Matteo. Then she said something, 3 syllables, the same 3 syllables as before, with a rising tonal inflection at the end. "She says your name," Neva Roth said. "She told the duty officer when he spoke with her before the transport. We did not know what name it was until now." Matteo said. "Matteo," Sale said. The vowels in the Velthari tonal pattern, slightly different but deliberate and clear. Neva Roth was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, the precise formal quality of her compact standard was still there, but underneath it something more personal was present, finding its way through the available language toward something the language wasn't quite built to hold. "The mission will be in contact with your organization formally," she said. "There is a protocol. I want you to understand that the formal response is not the whole of what I mean to say, and that I know it is inadequate, and that I am saying it formally first because my people do not have other words for situations like this yet. We say gratitude for things of ordinary weight, and for things of this weight we say it larger and more formally, and it is still inadequate, but I want you to know the difference between the formality and what I mean underneath it." Matteo didn't know what to say to that. He said, "I understand." She nodded, a deliberate single nod, a full-weight acknowledgement rather than a casual one. Then she looked at Develle, and at Orvith, and around the room in a single comprehensive assessment that took in the understocked supply cabinet, and the repaired diagnostic unit, and the cold tea, and the whole texture of a post that had been doing important work with insufficient resources for too long. "The mission will also be in contact with this post," she said. "Separately, that is a different conversation and a longer one, but I want you to know it is coming." She carried Sale toward the door. At the threshold, Sale lifted her head from her aunt's shoulder and looked back at Matteo. "Matteo," she said, the rising tonal inflection again at the end. Not a question exactly, but something close to it. The Velthari child's way of checking that a name matched a presence, that the presence was still there. Still here, Matteo said. Sale watched him for one more moment. Then she laid her head back on Neva Roth's shoulder, and the mission transport pulled away from the receiving bay at 8:31. The Compact's inquiry into the unauthorized crossing took 11 days. Matteo answered every question accurately and completely. He had a timeline prepared. He'd started it at 3:47 when the ceasefire feeds went to buffering, and he'd been adding timestamps to it continuously, with an attention to sequence and detail that came from 8 months of filing records that needed to be precise in order to be useful. The inquiry panel read the timeline. They read DeVel's priority alert filing record. They read Velith's report, which was complete and accurate on every point, and which, as a document, was the specific kind of complex that said a great deal by putting accurate facts in close proximity to each other without editorializing. The Post's legal coordinator, a woman named Suri Thal, who had been managing Compact legal interfaces for 12 years, and who had a very clear-eyed view of what Compact administrative processes were designed to accomplish, told Matteo on the morning of the first session that the inquiry would produce a formal record, a formal violation note, and a formal commendation, all in the same document. Because that was what the Compact's administrative process did when someone had clearly broken a protocol and clearly been right to do it, and the system needed a way to put both of those things in the official record, without setting a precedent for other people to break the same protocol under less clear-cut circumstances. She was right. The document was exactly that. Matteo read it carefully, filed it in the Post's records, and kept a copy in his own files because Suri Thal told him he should. His humanitarian aid clearance was suspended for 30 days. He spent part of the suspension sitting with the question of whether he would do it again. He thought he would. He couldn't fully articulate the decision tree. It wasn't that the protocol was wrong. It was that the protocol was designed for a situation where the timing could be managed, and the timing in this case could not be managed, and he had been the only variable in the situation that was not fixed. That was the honest accounting, as close as he could get to it. He knew the difference between recklessness and a clear-eyed decision, made with incomplete information under time pressure. He thought he'd made the second kind. He thought he might be wrong. He sat with that uncertainty for a few days and then set it aside, because sitting with it indefinitely was not going to make him less uncertain, and the database needed reorganizing. He spent the rest of the suspension reorganizing the supply routing database, which had been a structural disaster since before he arrived, the product of 2 years of workarounds and manual corrections and interim solutions that had calcified into the standing system, and which he had been meaning to address for 6 months, but had not had the uninterrupted time to properly do so. The suspension gave him that time at last. By the end of the 30 days, the database accurately reflected the Post's actual supply status, actual route capacity, and actual resource constraints. 3 of the Post's coordinators, working with the updated database for the first time, separately and without coordination, told him it was the most useful change the Post had made to its logistics infrastructure in the time they'd been there. DeVel, on the day his clearance was reinstated, printed the clearance document and stuck it to the wall above his desk with adhesive tape, without comment. The Velthari diplomatic mission's formal contact arrived on day 3 of the inquiry. It was a long document, not a short acknowledgement but a full substantive communication in both languages, signed by the mission's senior diplomatic coordinator, which Matteo gathered from context was a senior position. The formal section documented the mission's response in specific and committed terms, a full supply audit of the Post, to be followed by restocking of all identified gaps. A formal representation to the Compact's Corridor Command regarding the Post's resource allocation status, filed through the mission's official diplomatic channel. Permanent addition of the Post to the mission's priority transit registry, which Matteo understood to mean mission vehicles transiting the corridor would stop at the Post, and carry supply transfers from the northern compound, without advance request paperwork. That was the formal section. The informal section was shorter and from Neva Roth and in compact standard only. It said, "What I said to you at your post was inadequate to the situation. I knew that when I said it. I am writing it down anyway so that you have a record of the attempt and of the fact that the inadequacy belongs to the available language, not to the depth of what I mean. Sale is safe. She is with family. She asked about you this morning as she has asked every morning since I brought her home. I told her you were well. I hope this was accurate. At the bottom, she says your name the way she says the word for safe return. I wanted you to know that." Matteo read it twice. He filed the formal section in the Post's diplomatic records. He kept a copy of Neva Roth's note in his personal files, in a folder he did not label because the label he would have given it felt too large for a folder name. He wrote back to both sections the same day. The formal reply was professional and precise, acknowledging each of the mission's commitments and providing the specific information the supply audit would need, including a detailed version of the database reorganization he was in the middle of, and a frank accounting of the gaps that had been invisible in the old system. The reply to Neva Roth took him considerably longer. He wrote 4 drafts and sent the 4th one. It said, "You were right, and I appreciate you saying it in writing. The work here continues. Please tell Sale that Matteo is well. She can use the tonal pattern she prefers. She had it correctly." He wasn't sure if that was the right thing. He sent it anyway. The supply audit arrived on day 14. 3 mission coordinators came with scanning equipment and a comprehensive needs framework, and a Velthari logistics specialist named Fiera, who had the kind of meticulous professional attention that came from caring about whether systems actually worked rather than from caring about whether the paperwork said they did. She and Matteo spent 2 full days going through every storage room, every equipment shelf, every supply manifest, every outstanding requisition, and every requisition that had been filed and not resolved, and was still technically pending in the compact system despite being functionally abandoned. Fiera was good at her work. By the end of day 1 she had a clearer picture of the Post's actual supply situation than anyone had had in at least 2 years, and she was adding to the needs framework with a specificity that Matteo found useful in the way that it was useful to talk to someone who understood logistics as a discipline rather than as paperwork. They developed a working shorthand over the 2 days, not shared language exactly, but a shared vocabulary of professional concepts that crossed the species line because logistics was logistics. "I've worked with posts like this before," Fiera said, on the afternoon of day 2. Her translator unit handled the shift between Velthari and compact standard smoothly enough that Matteo had mostly stopped tracking the gap. A post that runs on workarounds and manual systems because the official systems are insufficient. The people who work in these posts are very good at the workarounds. They make the insufficient thing function. And then the function is used as evidence that the thing is sufficient, and the resource allocation doesn't change. "Yes," Matteo said. "We are going to put the actual situation in the record, formally, with specific documentation, through the mission's representation channel. I know I welcome it. You are not frustrated that it took this to make it happen." "I'm frustrated that it took this to make it happen," Matteo said. "I'm glad it's happening." Fiera looked at him for a moment with the amber Velthari eyes, a slightly different shade than Neva Roth's or Sale's, the amber varying across individuals the way it did in any species range. "The mission coordinator told me the circumstances before I came," she said. "He didn't say anything. I looked at the grid map before I came, the one covering the sector from that morning. It was a reasonable route," Matteo said, "given where the exchange actually was." "I know." She held his gaze with a steadiness that felt deliberate. "That is not what I was looking at it for. I was looking at it to understand what you saw when you looked at it, what the calculation was. It wasn't much of a calculation. I think it was a very precise one, Fiera said. That is a different thing from a complicated one. A pause. I have 2 children, she said, in the tone of someone adding a final line to a formal record, making sure the context was complete. She went back to her screen. 3 weeks after the inquiry closed, a package arrived through the mission courier system. Mission sealed, addressed to the post for his attention. He opened the protective case and found a piece of Velthari decorative work. A rectangular tile roughly the size of his palm, dark blue stone with a pattern inlaid in silver thread and amber-colored mineral. The pattern was intricate, the kind of thing that required time and attention, that didn't come from a kit or a template but from someone working out the design as they worked. A card at the bottom of the case, in compact standard, in the large, careful handwriting of someone practicing a new alphabet. This is for you. I made the pattern myself. Aunt Neva helped with the stone because the stone-setting tools are sharp. The pattern means safe return in the old Velthari writing. I looked it up in the mission library. There are 3 different symbols that all mean safe return, and I used all 3 because I could not decide which one was right, so I used all of them. At the bottom, in slightly larger letters than the rest, Sail. Matteo sat with it for a while. Then he moved things from his desk, the field manuals and the cold tea and the priority alert forms and the updated supply manifest that was finally accurate, and set the tile where he could see it from his chair. He filed his logistics report. He routed 2 supply requests through the new database, which was faster than it had ever been. He answered 4 messages from post coordinators in the northern sector about the updated manifest format. He filed a priority alert. It failed to route, which he noted in his timestamp record and continued filing anyway. He looked at the tile. The pattern in silver and amber, 3 symbols for safe return, all 3 because she couldn't choose. He went back to work. The corridor's situation changed slowly. The way these things always did, not a clean resolution but a gradual redistribution of what was contested and what wasn't. The exchange lines shifting north and east over the following months as the compact's ceasefire monitoring infrastructure was finally reinforced. The post's supply situation changed considerably faster than that, because the mission's formal representation moved through the compact's diplomatic channel rather than the standard requisition system, and the diplomatic channel had a different resolution timeline. The medical unit's diagnostic equipment was replaced first. Orvith, when the new unit was installed, ran her first diagnostic on it with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been working with a broken tool for so long that functioning tools had taken on an almost abstract quality, like something she knew existed in principle. The heating element in the tea dispenser was replaced in the 3rd month of resupply. Matteo, the first morning the dispenser produced hot tea, drank a cup of it standing at the equipment shelf and thought about the specific strangeness of improvements arriving, how they didn't feel like what he'd expected, how they felt instead like the world quietly correcting a thing that had been wrong for so long it had started to seem like the baseline. Devel, when the supply situation had stabilized enough that the worst of the requisition backlog was cleared, put in a formal request for 2 additional civilian liaison staff. The request was approved in 6 weeks. Matteo had never seen a staffing request approved in 6 weeks before. He suspected the mission's representation file had something to do with it, but he didn't ask. 6 months after the morning in the corridor, on a Tuesday in late spring, a message came through from the Velthari diplomatic mission. It was from Neva Roth. It said, Sail is attending the mission school now. Her teachers report that she is advanced in mathematics, in compact standard, and in formulating questions that her instructors find difficult to answer. Her compact standard tutor says she is the most precise 6-year-old she has worked with. The mathematics instructor says she has a structural mind, and that this is unusual at her age. I think she gets the precision from her mother. I wanted you to know she is doing well. She still says your name in the morning when she wakes up and is telling herself what is true. She says it the way she says safe return. I thought you should know that. Matteo read the message. He looked at the tile on his desk, the safe return pattern in silver and amber, sitting where he'd put it and where it had stayed. He wrote back, "Thank you for telling me. The post is in better supply than it has been since I arrived, which is the mission's work and Fiera's and yours, and I want you to know the difference it makes here in the work. We received a northern transfer last week that cleared 2 of the longest standing gaps in our medical supply. Please tell Sale that Matteo is well, and that the work continues." He sent it. Then he picked up the next priority alert form, which was failing to root, and started filling it out again from the beginning, because the timestamp record mattered, and because somewhere in the compact systems a data trail was building up, and because this was the work and he was going to keep doing it. Outside, the Velthari corridor was quieter than it had been in 2 years. Not quiet, it wasn't that, and probably wouldn't be for a long time, but quieter. The monitoring feeds were mostly green. The checkpoint gate at the southern boundary was open. Matteo filed the priority alert, noted the routing failure in his record, and started the next one. End.